Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking back 80 years to the spring of 1945,
Right.
as World War II is coming to an end. And we're going to a seemingly quiet town,
Okay.
Herdorf, Germany,
Interesting.
which became like this dramatic focal point
Wow.
as the war was ending.
I see.
And to do that, we have some really fascinating sources.
Okay.
So you really wanted to get a sense, not just of what happened, but the intensity of this very localized conflict
Yeah.
within the larger collapse of the German war effort at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a fascinating way to kind of get this micro view of these huge macro forces at play at the very end of the war.
So let's set the scene a little bit.
Okay.
March 1945,
Right.
Allied push into Germany. It's relentless at this point.
Yeah.
There's just been this huge turning point with the capture of the Regiment bridge.
Right.
How do these big movements directly impact a little town like Herdorf?
So if you look at the capture of the Regiment bridge, which happened on March 9th, the German high command was actually pretty shaken by this development.
Okay.
As we see from our Dayton source, they thought this could be a really decisive blow to their entire Western Front.
Wow.
Because it gave the Allies this crucial foothold across the Rhine River.
Yeah.
And to try to contain this and ultimately eliminate the bridgehead, the Germans had to divert a lot of resources. They were already really depleted at this point in the war.
Okay, so their focus shifts to Remagen.
Yeah, absolutely. But even as they're scrambling to do that, the Allies are pushing relentlessly northeastward. And this was around March 14th. We see this mentioned by the Wehrmacht leadership.
Okay.
They're already talking about the Allies having their sights set on the Autobahn and this vital Sieg River Valley.
So they're not stopping.
No, they're definitely not stopping. They're continuing this really big push eastward.
Got it. So help me unpack this a little bit because I want to make sure that we're all following. So as the Allied focus shifts eastward from the Rhine, are we saying then that the areas south of the Sieg River,
Right.
where Herdorf is situated,
Uh-huh.
these are becoming more exposed
Yes,
as
exactly.
the Germans are being pulled westward?
Precisely. Because they have to address that threat at Remagen. And by March 19th, the American forces were actively expanding this whole area of operations they had established out of the Remagen bridgehead.
Right.
So they're taking key terrain, securing these vital road connections. The Dayton source even talks about the 3rd Parachute Division. They were engaged in some pretty desperate fighting, but they were really weakened by this point. So it gives you a sense of the strain that was on all these German units at this point in the war.
Okay, so the pressure is really building for the Germans.
Absolutely. Inexorably, I'd say.
Okay, so let's move our attention specifically to Herdorf now.
Okay.
As the approaching storm, as we've called this section, really starts to gather.
Yeah. Now, the American account of the fighting really begins on or around March 28th.
Okay.
But even before those American troops actually launch their ground assault, there are these signs, there are hints that a conflict is coming.
Like what?
So, there's a Herdorf municipal report from 1946, and it mentions that there was an order for the civilian evacuation of Herdorf issued on March 26th.
So just a couple of days before the fighting really starts.
Right, exactly.
And did the residents comply? Did they leave?
Well, it seems like there was limited compliance. I mean, you can understand, can't you, that a lot of people would try to stay in their homes, maybe protect what possessions they had left.
Of course.
And a lot of them sought refuge in nearby mine tunnels, maybe hoping they could just kind of ride out the storm.
I mean, I can't even imagine how scary that would be.
Sure.
Our source mentions the Zufeli Gluck mine tunnel specifically.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like there?
It was really grim. The report actually describes these completely unprotected entrances and how severely overcrowded the tunnel was.
Oh, wow.
Some people were packed in there for over 36 hours with no sanitation, no light. You know, it really gives you a sense of what the civilian population was going through at this point.
Yeah, absolutely harrowing. So what was the German military presence in Herdorf itself at this point?
Well, both the American account and this municipal report talk about a small German rear guard that arrived on Wednesday, which would have been March 28th.
Okay.
And they were equipped with about 5 anti-tank guns. Yeah, just 5. But there's this really interesting detail. White flags actually appeared on the church towers.
Oh, wow. Signaling surrender.
Potentially, yeah. But the commander of this small detachment, he was having none of it. He had the flags taken down straight away. And in fact, he even opened fire on a low-flying Allied reconnaissance plane with a 2-centimeter anti-aircraft gun.
Really?
Yeah,
So even though the war is pretty much lost at this point,
right.
some are still clinging to that fight.
Absolutely. And it really underscores, this tension that we see in a lot of these final days,
Uh-huh.
this widespread awareness of defeat, but also the fierce resistance that some individuals and units were still putting up. It was happening in all these little localized conflicts.
Yeah, fascinating. So were there other German troops in the area?
The municipal report mentions a German artillery unit, but they are withdrawing.
Oh,
Yeah, they didn't have enough ammunition.
so supply lines are really starting to break down.
Exactly. They were already facing critical shortages. But there were still about 100 German infantry soldiers, and they soon found themselves in a direct engagement with those advancing American forces.
And where was this fighting taking place?
Well, both the American account and the recollections of a local resident, Alphonse Reifenrath, mention heavy shelling of Herdorf from the south.
The south.
Yeah, specifically from the Westerwald Hills. And this artillery fire was starting fires, targeting the wooded slopes east of the Heller River.
Okay.
Reifenrath, actually, he gives this really vivid account of the shells landing near his home.
Wow.
And he also mentions witnessing a Ritterkreuzträger, that's a holder of the Knight's Cross, leading the small German detachment defending Herdorf.
So even this tiny group had a highly decorated commander.
It did.
That seems to suggest that there was some strategic or symbolic importance, even at this late stage, to holding Herdorf.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? It makes you wonder what was going through their minds. And we can't forget about the air raids that happened before all of this. Our Luftangriff auf Herdorf source talks about how the whole region was targeted 15 times between 1940 and March 1945.
15 times.
15 times. The main targets for these attacks were the Herdorf railway station and the Betzdorf-Heger railway line.
And Betzdorf, that's just a stone's throw from Herdorf, right?
Yeah.
And they had that devastating bombing on March 12th.
Oh, absolutely devastating. 116 U.S. bombers. They dropped over 260 tons of bombs on Betzdorf in just 11 minutes.
Wow.
The railway station was completely obliterated.
11 minutes.
11 minutes. Imagine that.
Yeah.
About 500 direct hits on the station alone. Our context source really highlights the impact of this. 63 people dead, widespread destruction, and a massive disruption to the Wehrmacht's supply lines. This bombing was definitely a big precursor to the ground fighting in Herdorf.
Right.
It really weakened the German ability to resupply and reinforce.
So it's this logical progression, right? Air power softens the target, then the infantry moves in.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have the evacuation order, the arrival of this small German rear guard, the intense shelling, and the preceding air raids. It seems like all the pieces are in place.
Yeah, you could say that. The stage is set for what would become the Battle for Herdorf.
So let's talk about the Battle for Herdorf itself.
Okay, so the American account, it mainly focuses on the actions of the 8th Infantry Division.
Right.
They were under the command of Major General Moore, and their attacks began around March 28th.
Okay.
They involved the 13th, the 28th, and the 121st Regiments. And specifically, it was the 13th Battalion of the 13th Regiment that was tasked with advancing towards Herdorf and the neighboring town of Struthen.
Okay, and did they face much resistance right away?
Initially, it seems like they didn't. The American report talks about the absence of any really significant German resistance south of Herdorf.
So it was a relatively easy advance at first.
Yeah, you could say that. But things changed pretty dramatically once the 10th Battalion reached the edge of Herdorf itself.
Okay, so what happened?
Well, that's when those 5 German anti-tank guns we mentioned, the ones positioned near the San Fernando mine, they opened fire.
Wow, can you imagine you're advancing, you're thinking maybe there's not much resistance, and then suddenly you're facing anti-tank fire?
It must have been a real shock for those American troops.
So what do they do?
Well, according to the account, after they'd used up all their ammunition, about 100 German grenadiers launched this really desperate counterattack. They charged straight at the American position.
Really a full-on charge.
Yeah, and that's when the fighting turned into this really intense house-to-house battle. The American account actually uses the German phrase Zermürbenden Häuserkampf to describe it.
Zermürbenden Häuserkampf. What does that mean?
It means a grueling attritional battle. You know, the kind of fighting that happens building by building, room by room. It was brutal, close quarters combat.
And how long did this go on for?
It lasted until about midnight.
Midnight, so hours of hand-to-hand fighting.
Hours of it. And only after this prolonged and really intense struggle did the German resistance in Herdorf itself start to break down.
So they finally took the town.
They did. And after Herdorf fell, the American forces moved pretty quickly to capture the nearby towns of Grissenbach, Helgersdorf, and Salkendorf.
Wow.
And as the remaining German forces retreated, the level of resistance dropped off significantly.
So what was the cost of this battle? How many casualties were there?
Well, in Herdorf itself, 8 German soldiers and an unknown number of American soldiers were killed.
Wow.
Tragically, 9 civilians also lost their lives during this time. The American account specifically mentions a member of the Volkssturm who refused to surrender.
The Volkssturm.
Yeah, that was the German militia, often older men and younger boys.
Right.
And they also mention a wounded German lieutenant who also refused to surrender.
So even in defeat, some were still unwilling to give up.
Absolutely. And it really shows the kind of desperation and almost fanaticism that you saw in those last weeks of the war.
Yeah.
It's really sobering to think about these individual tragedies that were happening as part of this much larger historical event.
Absolutely. So let's dive a little deeper into these American perspectives.
Okay.
As detailed in the 23rd Infantry Regiment's Battalion report, what can we learn from that?
This report, it's incredible. It gives this really detailed account of the American experience. It even breaks down the fighting almost minute by minute.
Wow.
For example, it talks about Lieutenant Kilgore's night attack on Söderbachtal at 2 a.m.
Söderbachtal.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that they went in without any artillery support.
Really? Why would they do that?
Well, it seems like they wanted to achieve complete surprise.
So a risky move, but potentially a very effective one.
Exactly. And it seems like it paid off in terms of surprise.
Okay, so they were successful at Söderbachtal. What happened next?
Well, after that initial success, Easy and George companies, they started to advance towards Herdorf-Struthofen.
Herdorf-Struthofen, that's the neighboring town.
Yeah, exactly. But their advance was halted pretty quickly by incredibly heavy machine gun and small arms fire.
Wow.
And this was even after they'd managed to take a high point.
So they had a tactical advantage.
They did.
But still couldn't overcome the German defenses.
Right. The report actually specifically says that American artillery wasn't effective in suppressing this resistance.
Really? Why not?
It's not clear from the report, but it seems like the German defenders were really well dug in. They had good positions, and they were putting up a fierce fight. And there's even mention of 20-millimeter flak fire coming from the area around Treeshirt.
So despite being outnumbered and facing a much larger force, the Germans were still holding their ground.
Exactly. They were using effective weaponry. They had established positions. It was a well-coordinated defense.
Okay, so the Americans couldn't advance. What did they do?
Well, this heavy fire forced Easy and George companies to withdraw and regroup. They fell back to an area near the Friedrich Wilhelm Hut.
And did they give up on the attack?
No, they didn't. They regrouped, and then they launched another assault on Herdorf-Struthofen. And Lieutenant Kilgore, he was leading the charge again.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And this is where the story takes a really tragic turn.
Yeah, the death of Lieutenant Kilgore.
Right. So according to the account, right after he got permission to lead the attack into Herdorf itself, Lieutenant Kilgore was shot in the chest.
Oh, wow.
By a German sniper. And his last words, they were, "Okay, just one more minute."
Wow.
He died in the arms of Lieutenant Schragens.
Wow. That's incredibly sad. Just goes to show the human cost of war, doesn't it?
Yeah.
These individual stories, they're so powerful.
They really are.
So what happened after Lieutenant Kilgore was killed?
Well, Lieutenant Schragens took command of Fox Company, and they continued the attack.
Yeah.
They pushed into Herdorf, starting near Josefhäuschen and then spreading through the Glockenfeld area into the heart of the town. And that led to the really intense house-to-house fighting that we talked about earlier.
Right. And the American report, it actually names some of the German soldiers who were killed in the fighting, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It lists 4 German soldiers who were killed in the Glockenfeld area. Another one was killed near the cemetery. And then there was Volkssturmführer Otto Schulte. He was shot on Friedrichstrasse after refusing to surrender 3 times.
Wow.
And then in Kesselstruth, Lieutenant Willy Mielke and Private Wolfgang Bishop were killed. It's believed that Private Bishop was actually trying to help Lieutenant Mielke, who'd been wounded, when they were both killed.
Oh, wow.
Their bodies were later recovered by the Americans, and they were buried in Iddenbach.
And what were the American losses?
The battalion report lists 5 soldiers and, of course, Lieutenant Kilgore killed in action. They also had 6 wounded and 1 missing.
So a significant cost on both sides for what seems like a relatively small battle.
It was a heavy price to pay.
The report also mentions a patrol conducted by George Company after Herdorf had been captured. What was their objective?
They were trying to link up with the I Battalion.
Okay,
And during this patrol, they came across a German Panther tank.
a Panther tank.
Yeah, near the railway underpass just before Sassenroth. They managed to destroy it using close quarters anti-tank weapons.
So even after Herdorf had fallen, there were still German armored vehicles operating in the area.
There were.
Wow. So let's zoom out again a little bit and consider the broader context and the aftermath of the battle for Herdorf.
Okay.
As we mentioned earlier, this fighting took place against the backdrop of the larger Allied advance that followed the Remagen bridgehead, which had been established around March 7th. Our context source talks about the 1st US Infantry Division pushing towards the Sieg River via Altenkirchen.
Right.
And it's interesting to note that while Herdorf saw this intense fighting on the 29th, other nearby areas had actually been secured by the Allies even earlier.
Yeah, like Dayton, for instance.
Well,
That was secured by midday on March 28th.
Got it.
And the context source suggests that the American occupation of the whole Siegerland region started around that time. It seems like Herdorf was initially bypassed or maybe just saw some minor skirmishes as the main German forces were already in retreat. But then as the American 8th Infantry Division shifted its focus towards Siegen, which is north of Herdorf, the fighting in Herdorf intensified.
So the focus shifted and Herdorf got caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, you could say that. And Siegen itself fell to the Americans pretty quickly after that. It was captured by April 8th. And our context source says that this basically eliminated any organized German resistance in the entire region.
Wow. So the war was essentially over for this part of Germany.
This part, yeah.
What about the civilians in Herdorf? What happened to them after the fighting ended?
Well, we've already talked about the evacuation order and the conditions in that mine tunnel. But Alfons Reifenrath's personal account, it provides a really powerful and intimate perspective on what it was like for the civilians. He witnessed the shelling and the small German detachment firsthand, and then he talks about finding the bodies of German soldiers after the fighting.
Oh.
There's this one story that he tells that's particularly poignant. It's about an unknown soldier whose personal belongings had been lost in all the chaos. And it just underscores the anonymity and the tragedy of war, doesn't it?
It does. It's so easy to forget about those individual stories when you're talking about these big historical events.
Exactly. And the Herdorf Municipal Report from 1946, that also sheds some light on the aftermath of the fighting. It talks about the challenges of trying to restore order and rebuild the community.
What kind of challenges?
Well, for one thing, there was a lot of looting, not just by foreign workers who were in the area, but also by some local residents.
Real?
Yeah. It also mentions the establishment of a local police force.
Okay.
And get this, the guy they appointed as police chief, he ended up becoming the acting mayor because he could speak English.
Wow, so that's a direct impact of the Allied occupation.
It is. And the report also talks about how difficult it was to provide basic necessities for the people and just to reestablish some kind of order.
So even after the fighting ended, the situation was still really chaotic.
It was. And tragically, the civilian death toll in Herdorf remained really high even after the battle.
Really? Why is that?
Well, the report records a much higher number of burials in 1945 than in the years before or after.
Wow.
And a lot of those burials were children. It really speaks to the overall devastation and the disruption of life that the war caused.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about the fighting on that one day in March. It was the cumulative effect of years of war.
Right.
You know, culminating in this intense, localized conflict and its long-lasting consequences.
So it's a really powerful reminder that the end of the war wasn't this neat and tidy event.
It wasn't.
It played out in all these different ways in communities across Europe.
Absolutely.
So to wrap things up, we've taken a really close look at the battle for Herdorf.
We have.
We've seen the intense fighting, the human cost, and the challenges of rebuilding in the aftermath.
Yeah.
It's a story that really highlights the devastating final stages of World War II, even in a place that might seem insignificant on the grand scale of the conflict.
It's a microcosm of the wider war, isn't it?
Absolutely. And when you consider the different perspectives we've explored, the American military accounts, the recollections of local civilians like Alfons Reifenrath, and the official municipal report, it really makes you think about the complexities of historical memory.
Yeah, how different people experience and remember the same events.
Exactly. And the story of that unknown German soldier that Alfons Reifenrath talks about, that's a powerful reminder that there are countless individual tragedies within these big historical narratives.
So many stories that are often lost or forgotten.
So I hope that this deep dive has maybe sparked some curiosity
Yeah.
to explore the local histories of World War II in your own region.
There are so many fascinating stories out there waiting to be discovered.
And often it's in these smaller localized stories that we find the most powerful and human connections to the past.
I completely agree. It's by delving into these individual stories that we can truly understand the impact of these major events on real people.
Yeah.
Well said.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.